talk on hacking the ROI and how to derive the most possible business value from your penetration tests. And this talk really arose from the fact where, as a penetration testing consultant, I've been engaged with many clients, and on both sides of the spectrum, I've noticed deficiencies where their money wasn't getting the maximum impact it could have gotten from the test. But first off, a little bit about me. I'm an attack and penetration consultant for Optiv Security. I'm based out of Charlotte, North Carolina, and have a background as a full stack developer before getting into security. And I spend a lot of my free time developing various security tools that I later find out that someone else has already made. So they usually don't see the light of day, but that's much to the dismay of my wife, by the way. But other than that, I got a little bit of an alphabet soup as well. But let's move on. Let's talk about the ideal world for a penetration tester. You have loose rules of engagement, an amazing attack chain. You're crossing CDEs, getting domain admins, popping shells all over the place. But at the end of the day, does that really translate into value? Not necessarily, because it really depends on why you were engaged and why the client is paying all this money for you to pull this off. If you just give them just a cluster of a report, it's not going to really get that much value no matter how bad you owned them or how many findings you actually identified. So this really goes on to why I'm giving this talk. And the first step of any engagement is going through scoping, kind of identifying what your objective is. And the first step of scoping is you've got to determine your motivation. Whenever you engage in a penetration test, the motivation should always be clear. That is the first question that absolutely needs to be answered. Because otherwise, you're basically just ordering like one pen test, please, and at the end of the day, you may not get what your actual objective was. So it may be closing the gaps in an existing, very mature security program, but it also may be for HIPAA or financial compliance. And this is something that needs to be identified very early on within the blue team and the client side, as well as needs to be communicated to the red team that's being engaged. And this will really help you identify your goals. So your goals are that subset of the motivation of a couple of things that you really want to accomplish when you're performing an assessment. And this will ensure that you are really getting that value. Motivation and goals are probably the two biggest things that if you can identify, you will get the most bang for your buck. But goals may include testing a new product. If you're like a medical device company or you're rolling out a new piece of software into production, or testing segmentation for PCI requirements, or just in a retail environment. So a lot of the times we see clients that don't have a clear motivation or clear goals going into a penetration test, and when they get the report, they kind of put their hands up in the air like, all right, what do we do now? And that's something that I really want to see change in our industry, of having really clearly defined motivations behind getting assessments. And this kind of translates into what are the actual needs of your security program. Some clients will come in and say, hey, I want a penetration test. And we ask, have you ever had a penetration test before? And they're like, nope, this is the first one. And that kind of raises some red flags, because sometimes a vulnerability assessment or a simple scanning program would get them the most value for their dollar, because identifying those root cause deficiencies in your environment will really help you kind of mature your security program to a point where having that manual testing will yield a lot more value to you. But this kind of goes into the red team and blue team responsibilities on this subject. Because as a blue team, you need to understand what your program maturity is. if you just started vulnerability scanning and just rolled out your patch management program, you're probably still in the very early phases of your program and may not be ready for a full-out penetration test. Maybe test parts of your environment or just get a simple vulnerability assessment. But as a red team, it's really your responsibility to advise them and identify deficiencies in their program, and if it's immature, make those recommendations that will guide them in the right direction to really get what they need and not necessarily what they want. Because there are people in our industry, as you all well know, that are going to try to upsell you. They're going to try to sell you a lot of stuff that you don't need, that will ultimately yield you with a bunch of paperwork that you don't really know how to decipher or take action on. So this not falling victim to unnecessary purchases is really a key tenet of this, of knowing where you're at, having a red team that will advise you on what you need. As well as a great example of this is, let's say you have an environment with 10,000 hosts, a couple different domains, and you really want to get a penetration test of that environment. Well, that's going to be very, very expensive. So if you really look at it, you want to identify the root cause deficiencies inside your environment. And that may not require testing all 10,000 hosts. That may require only testing a subset of your environment that falls under your entire security program. That will help you get an idea of where you're failing and what is really causing your issues, and so that you can identify that root cause and remediate it across your environment. So that's probably one of the biggest things that we see, is that clients don't necessarily understand that taking sampling of their environments can sometimes be just as effective, if not more effective, than testing the entire environment. But granted, this is in a subset of cases, because sometimes you may need to test the entire environment, and that's where your motivation and goals really come into play. Next, I thought I really wanted to touch on this because I feel like communication, as IT people, we know that sometimes we are not the best communicators. And it's one of those things that I feel that everyone could do a bit better job of making sure that information is disseminated across the team, across blue and red. It's really one of those things that I feel like could be improved the most upon. And that really falls under like information about the environment when you're conducting these tests. Really knowing your environment, knowing your sensitive assets, which include your highest risk assets in your environment that basically will cause you the greatest business risk. And from a risk assessment, you should already know these. And these should be communicated to your blue team members, to your red team, and so they can identify where they need to take it easy, where they need to be careful. Also, where if they compromise would cause you the most harm. Because that way they will know what really matters to your business and what will show you like where the deficiencies in your security program are putting your business at risk. Furthermore, ongoing issues in the environment are absolutely critical to be communicated across, again, your blue and red teams. Because these ongoing issues, I can't tell you how many times that me or a teammate has been blamed for an issue that has been ongoing in an environment for the past year. And then that causes the entire test to come to a halt. We are currently billing at that time, and that leads to wasted dollars on the client side. So having this information communicated to the red team will let them know where the environment is kind of a little finicky, where it's soft, and where they can really keep an eye out. Because this will kind of keep that communication line open if these issues arise. And finally, the whole tenet of this is sharing is caring, guys. It's really, really important to share as much information as possible because the more information that is shared between the two and even internally, the smoother all of these assessments are going to go. And the more people are going to learn, the more they're going to just overall just grow inside your organization and as the red team that you're engaging. And as we move on, we're going to go on to testing. And oh yeah, this is the Optiv required testing uniform, by the way. But testing, I'm going to touch light on testing because it's all self-explanatory. It's where we pop shells and do the magic. But there are some things about testing that are not really touched on heavy enough, in my opinion. The infrastructure of your tests is critical. Defining your methodology is one of the single biggest things I think a red team can do to improve the quality of their tests. Because any red teamer knows that they have their specialty, whether it be wireless, web applications, networks. It's something that's their bread and butter and they're great at. The others, they may be good or they may be mediocre at, and that's something that we really need to identify as red teamers to increase the quality of our penetration tests. As a client, you should really ensure that the red team that you're engaging, they do have a defined methodology, because that will give you an idea of what's being done, what you're paying for, and what is the quality that you can expect from essentially the service that you're purchasing, whether it be your internal red team or an external assessor. Finally, having open communication channels basically between the red team and the blue team during testing will just have the whole testing process go smoother, because they can let people know of ongoing issues, anything that arises during the test, whether it be critical findings or say host being down. It's one of those things that time wasted is money wasted. So anything that you can do to eliminate wasted time is amazing. So I'm going to move on to the most important part of any test. Sorry, I got a little bit ahead of myself. But people forget that when they engage a red team, that the red team goes off and does their thing, but they forget that the red team is actually, they are the attack experts coming in, the offensive consultants. And these consultants, they have a plethora of knowledge that your blue team may not necessarily be completely knowledgeable in. So we're really here to help. As red teamers, we're here to help improve the security of the environment. And this is where questions come in, like, what controls can I implement that will basically make your life the hardest? And where to implement multi-factor auth is a good example of those. As well as how can I track the assets and patches that really matter, that will really deter an attacker inside my environment, as well as detection in regards to PowerShell. And finally, what information security processes can I implement in my environment, or what do you think is deficient at this current point? It's one of those things that is, I encounter a lot of clients will engage us, and then they'll kind of set and forget and do their own thing, and they forget that you are really engaging these people as consultants inside your environment. Even if they're an internal red team, they are still getting a view of the environment that you don't necessarily get to see day to day. If you're an engineer, you work on your specified work that is directed by your security manager. If you're a security manager, you're busy managing all of your resources. But with that in mind, now I'm going to move to the most important part of any penetration test, and that's reporting. Because what people tend to forget is that a penetration test, essentially what you're paying for is a really, really expensive set of documents. Because at the end of the day, this is what is going to give you the idea of your risk profile inside your environment. This is really directed to the red teamers writing the report. In order to really make that report impactful, you have to remember the motivation. As you go through the report, the motivation will guide the entire, the tone, the focus, and pretty much everything in the report, because that client is really trying to solve this one issue. And if you don't really focus on that in the report, and they have to spend time deciphering what you're trying to say and what really matters to them, then you have not done your job. And that is something that I see a lot, is that what the client wants is not necessarily prioritized in the report writing. And that's something I think that a lot of people, including myself, could do better at. Next, with the motivation in mind, we got to remember the audience. With any report, the audience is going to be generally 3 groups. You're going to have your CISO, your executive level, your security manager, and your engineer. So let's consider the executive level is really concerned about risk, right? They're concerned about their overall risk profile that their IT assets have to their business. And what did you do, as well as what can they do to remediate this risk that you identified? And a lot of the times, this has to be succinctly stated, because they're going to read probably the first couple pages in the report to really get an idea of what was done, and then begin taking action. And that action is going to probably be delegated to that security manager. And that security manager is going to go on to read the stuff that's more related to the root cause deficiencies inside those environments, what all the vulnerabilities were related to, where their program is lacking, if their patch management program had fallen through on some assets. It's one of those things that people tend to forget, that all 3 of these levels have different job responsibilities, and they have different resources available to them. So with that in mind, the security manager is going to look at the vulnerabilities that came in, the impact that the testers had identified inside the environment, and delegate that to his engineers. And those engineers, it's absolutely critical that they can go through the report and see what the vulnerabilities were. They can find them inside the environment. They can understand what those vulnerabilities are, and then proceed to remediate them in a realistic way. And that really is so critical to give them a solution that is actionable. Because a lot of the times there are solutions that you can recommend for a vulnerability that are just not feasible inside the business. Whether it be a service being open to the internet that's a business critical system, they cannot take that service off the internet. And I know that all of y'all probably have experienced that one time or another. It's like, why do we have this here? But at the end of the day, it's all the business. And that's the key tenet of this talk, is that this business needs to generate value. And sometimes you need to accept a high-risk vulnerability in order to keep the business running. And that's something that really needs to be kept in mind when you're providing these solutions on vulnerabilities. And moving on, this is something that I know that testers get really excited. If any of y'all are red teamer, any of y'all red teamers in here, then you know it's like going through an environment and you're like popping shells. It's just exactly you kind of you're doing that, and you're at your keyboard. It's amazing. You're having so much fun. But the thing to keep in mind is that findings cost money. Everything you find is going to cost the client or your organization money. And that's why you really need to act accordingly. And when you're presenting this to whoever it be, whether it be the executive leadership or the security manager, really kind of put your tone in the way that you're helping them and that you are optimistic about helping their security program. Going in there and saying, yeah, man, you're totally effed, that may be the case, but you got to phrase it a little bit differently. You know, this is about being professional. So you really got to weigh that presentation in the report of giving them, again, actionable things that they can look at and be like, hey, this is the top thing that you need to implement. You know, like you need to implement multi-factor auth on the perimeter, like first thing. And giving them a prioritization and lending your expertise to the client is absolutely critical, because this is what they're paying you for at the end of the day, is to give them that perspective. And moving on, in terms of giving them a perspective, it's one of those things that, again, I don't see many clients do, and they definitely not enough do it. Is y'all know the old adage, give a man a fish, he eats for a day. Teach a man to fish, he eats for a lifetime. And that's something that really needs to be kept in mind, is that giving clients information that they can take and implement in their program, and prompting them to ask questions of you of what could deter you the most. Like I mentioned in the testing phase, what did you see in my environment? Like, how did you do this? Or how did you identify this asset? It's one of those things where they have insight into an attacker's mind, and are able to get that information and actually get defensive strategies back, which I think is probably the most valuable part of a penetration test, because that way you can see what attackers are looking for, what they're exploiting, and what you can do to make their life difficult. And finally, again, I can't stress this enough, is providing the actionable recommendations. I put this here again because it's another thing that I feel like is not accounted for necessarily enough, because you have your default solutions. You know, I know that you probably have a reporting platform that has your solutions to your vulnerabilities, right? Sometimes you kind of look like a doofus when you say, hey, you need to implement a solution. They're like, we can't do that. And it's very much about molding a solution for a client, helping them come up with a solution and working with them. Because as a client, it's about, again, asking a question of that tester. It's like, hey, we can't do that. How do you think we can reduce our risk on this particular finding? And at the end of the day, it's these questions in this reporting process that will generate the most possible value for a client in their penetration test. And that is all I have for today. I can credit my wonderful wife with these amazing slides, because I do not have a design bone in my body, but luckily I married someone that did. But now we'll open up the floor for questions, so feel free. Thank you.
So, okay, let's say you were trying to get a job as a pen tester, and then you know this part of the ROI. You got to talk to HR on how you can maximize their profits. What key points would you hit on when you're trying to get a job and you're trying to talk about in terms of money?
So, are you trying to break into the pen testing field?
Right.
So, basically, when you're talking to HR, they probably won't ask those questions. But if you're in an interview, probably with the hiring manager, if you get to that point in the interview, just talking about your interfacing with clients and what you can do to advise clients and be kind of more of that consulting aspect, and kind of just providing guidance and helping guide clients in the right direction is probably one of the biggest things that they'll see as an asset in you as like a penetration tester.
find the most effective as far as in your communication and through your reporting? What have you found to be the most effective?
Could you repeat the question?
In terms of the reports that you provide, what has been the most effective? Are they looking for like something specific? What have you found that's really hitting the nail?
One thing that I know that we do on our reporting is that some people, I've worked at other shops in the past, have not done, is one is manual validation of findings to reduce false positives. Not having any false positives in the report makes people very happy. But two is making sure you have that report review call and sitting down with everyone and reviewing the report with the red team so that questions can be asked and kind of get more feedback on it. But also providing a robust executive summary is probably one of the biggest things that I've seen clients really appreciate, is that kind of really identifying the risk aspects, and so in providing them guidance on what actionable steps they can take from top to bottom, rather than just handing them a list of findings and being like, hey, here you go, good luck. Kind of giving them an idea of what to remediate first, next, and then kind of further down the line.
So more from a qualitative aspect than numbers.
Yeah, exactly. So it's kind of doing the interpretation for the client, because as an attacker, I feel like, or at least an attacker understands the risk, the actual exploitability of a vulnerability a bit more than just a CVSS score. So it provides a bit more of like you said, a qualitative assessment of their environment, rather than just, hey, you have X number of high-risk findings, X number of medium findings, etc.
One of the things that I've noticed in my past experience with, especially in the executive part of it, the executive summary, if you see that there are certain things that they are doing and are doing well, make sure that you mention that so that they can see that they're getting a return on their investment for the things that they are doing and doing well. And too many times, if you don't have a good penetration testing team that comes in, or company, they don't give that feedback. So a lot of times the executives don't see that. So the only thing they're seeing is what's wrong and not necessarily what's right. So I think that's something we got to keep to remember, that when we do these reports.
Absolutely.
On the subject of risk and exploitability, do you find value in things like the dread, dread scoring, where you can then use that to also do things like probability of something actually being detected and then exploited, and do you use that in your methodology?
I do not. Could you elaborate on dread scoring? I think it would be valuable.
So dread scoring is something that I think Microsoft developed. It's basically it's like an alternative to CVSS, but it also takes into account things like whether there are tools available, the amount of skill that is required, and things like that. I've found that particularly useful because it's I'll talk after.
Yeah. No, I definitely think that the dread score is definitely is definitely a good measure, as well as a lot of the times we tend to kind of come up with our own CVSS scores based on what we've observed in the environment. So if it's let's say you have a cross-site scripting vulnerability, but it's like behind authentication and you need admin in order to access it, then the actual risk associated with that vulnerability is much lower than an unauthenticated cross-site scripting, for example. So it's really one of those things that I think as an industry we can do a bit better of defining the risk behind vulnerabilities a bit more quantitatively, rather than what we basically have to do now is you have a base score for a class of vulnerability, and then you kind of gotta weigh your options individually in a way.
So, some of the responses or recommendations that you have to come back with are kind of organizational, not necessarily technical fixes. How far down do you work with the the client trying to figure out some of that stuff
Um,
when you're writing this report?
well, in the beginning, I know that on my team, we in the past have simply kind of gone through the processes recommendation and then worked with the client up to a point with the report of recommending what they can do. But I know that now other companies, as well as I think that Optiv is starting to actually deploy people out to help clients fix these vulnerabilities, because sometimes clients aren't equipped to deal with a large scope, basically a large scope organizational problem, and that having like external consultants really help guide them in order to implement it correctly. So I know that Optiv hasn't done it in the past, but we are starting to do it. But I have been at organizations that do that, and that is something I think that clients have found really valuable, is kind of getting that knowledge sharing and training their team of how to implement it correctly and run it correctly. All right. If no one has any more questions, I really appreciate all y'all's time, and hope you have a good rest of the conference.